If an engineer had ever wanted to feel isolated from all other life, no place was better than the dark and secluded fifth-tier basement that was the technical data storage department. The rooms were all unlocked, all of the lights operated on manual controls, and the only people who came down there were either interns dropping off boxes or the rare data analyst going over potential cases. Nobody would want to stick around in an eerily silent office that wasn't even programmed into the cleaning droid listings. Except for Thomas, that is. He had initially partnered up with the legal bureau as a short-term assistant, as a means of padding his income. But he found the work was actually a lot of fun. He was still a critical component when it came to the Jubilee system, so until his contract ended and the weapon was online, he had no choice but to remain a part-time data reviewer. An unexpected bonus was the atmosphere of the subterranean level. The silent atmosphere and chilly temperature was an amazing place to relax to some chill beats and read the mountains of uncategorized technical files. Today had been a blessed reprieve after a long week of unmet quotas. The list was never ending. The parts he had ordered hadn't shown up yet. Some quality checks failed again. Test guys burned out another capacitor bank. The customer wanted something changed at the worst possible time, and so many other small issues. Here, though, he didn't have to be lead designer and head engineer Lowell. Here he could just be Tom the techie. So it was that Thomas had been reading and annotating an unending tide of designs and calculations without disturbance for 3 peaceful hours. He didn't bother to turn on the lights for the entire floor, and instead had just used the light of a simple lamp at his desk in a previously empty office room. He had set aside a pile of interesting folders that had the potential to be workable cases, and at his feet were 3 boxes worth of mundane invention patents. His favorite mug had joined him in these dark halls, and had earned a permanent seat next to an appropriated coffee maker from the musty break room down the hall. The file he was currently dissecting was a novel-length stack of trial runs performed using a grossly over-engineered matter joiner. Welds anything to everything, it had proclaimed, though the math made it seem more like a hot glue gun with how flimsy the joins had been. He was about to read the next thrilling page when he heard a noise from the main room. A quiet voice was calling his name, and he could recognize the owner immediately. He called out through the open door, "Pat, over here! Door 3 on the right side." The rapid shuffling of footsteps from outside announced the arrival of a Thridril IT worker named Pat Darrow on Sligoof. He was small compared to Thomas, though 3'5" is apparently a good height for his species. The shadows hid the dark green ambush predator quite well. His 6 padded feet tapped as he made his way beside Thomas. His jagged teeth twisted into his closest attempt at a smile, and all 6 of his narrow yellow eyes locked onto his own 2 blues. Pat's voice was a monotone, soft hum, a trait that came from his species' underdeveloped vocal cords. "Coworker Thomas, the time for rest and nutrient consumption is soon. Lunchtime already? Suppose that means you came down here for the usual, yeah?" He'd been working for the Bureau for a little over 2 months, and in that time he and Pat had gotten along quite well. The little guy was a young tech support guru with a deep appreciation for Earth cuisine, the highest of them being chocolate. The two usually spent their lunchtime talking geek and sharing snacks. The spider-esque fellow nodded excitedly as he took off a child-sized backpack. "This day is when you will give me coffee and Hershey chocolates in exchange for 1 Ronyun BLT. Our agreement was that." From his bag, he pulled out a foot-long sandwich that practically radiated the aroma of grilled meat. If Thomas wasn't salivating already, he definitely was now that the delectable sub was now free from its thin paper veil. The human's hand reached to the coffee maker and deftly input a command that told the machine to dispense a disposable cup filled to the brim with instant mocha. His other hand pulled open one of the drawers of the desk, revealing the space to have a small pile of full-size bars wrapped in brown plastic. "Right you are, little man. I got you covered." The two exchanged their goods, and they both hungrily dug in with reckless abandon. The look of unfiltered bliss on the many-legged techie left Thomas smiling in amusement. Thridril were one of the few species that could ingest a similar diet to humans, and for them, things like chocolate and coffee were like a taste of home, since they had plants that produced a similar tasting product. The biggest issue was the scale of production. since the world Pat was from was the only one his race had found with soil suitable for growing their equivalent for coffee beans and cocoa trees, even with advanced terraforming. The Earth version was hardier in comparison and could thrive in a much larger range of planets. The largest imported good between their races just so happened to be something Thomas always kept a decent stash of, even before he met his borderline addict of a coworker. Bless the great huntress, for her bounty is great. Pat practically went limp in his chair as he relished his sugary treat. His face was smeared with dark brown smudges, and his paper cup was tipped over on the desk, its contents already empty. By comparison, Thomas hadn't even made it halfway through his sandwich. This was by no means either of their faults, since one was savoring this alien delicacy, while the other was simply unable to hold back when faced with a candy bar made for a creature twice his size. Thomas wrapped the leftover meal back into its wrapper before stashing it for later consumption. Damn, that was good. Gonna have to find some way to get a hold of another one sometime. After a quick dust-off and wipe down with a napkin, he adjusted his posture and went back to work at his computer. Pat opened his tree-right eyes and glanced at his companion's workstation. "Coworker Thomas, this is our allotted time of rest. Should not we enjoy it to the greatest duration?" Without breaking his pace, the busy man reached over and grabbed another folder from the mountain looming at the edge of the desk, while simultaneously opening a blank data file. "I've got no problem with you chilling here, but I'm actually going slow right now, believe it or not. Compared to my regular job, this stuff is a breeze and way more interesting. Did you know that one of these files was about an artificial crystal that would multiply electrical currents fed through it? Cool stuff, even if it does violate the laws of thermodynamics, thus making it a level 7 safety hazard." Confused by the human's words, he simply nodded along to feign understanding. "Indeed, safety to the nest is our greatest mission." His attention drifted towards the looming stack of unprocessed documents, then to the coffee maker, and finally on the box of assorted confiscated items sitting against the far wall. He hadn't noticed it when he entered, due to it being out of the way, but the bold red print on the side was warning in 3 different languages not to touch it. What content does that container hold? Thomas looked to where he was pointing, moving his reading glasses out of the way so he could see it better in the dim light. "Oh, that's some stuff that needs to be inspected and tested before I can submit the report for their file. Most of them already have a matching file over here, but a few of them are things that have either already had their cases closed or are just mislabeled. May I sate my curiousness?" The small creature looked up at Thomas with all 6 eyes pleading for his approval, like a child asking for permission to play at the park. "Sadi away. Just don't open any containers or push any red buttons. Like I said, all of it needs to be looked over and run by the labs, so anything you mess with might be considered tampering. I don't think I need to tell you why you shouldn't do that, and I trust you not to get me in trouble." He returned his attention to his work, while the curious soul scampered over to the cardboard box in the corner. Pat rummaged through the box with delight. Some of these devices looked to be of alien make, perhaps all confiscated from various species that passed through customs on their way through the system. A few of the item tags confirmed his theory, as one of them said that the ray gun he held in his hands was seized in a raid 4 systems away. There was so much variety to the types of items he found as well. Canisters of unknown substances, faintly glowing rocks of every shape and size, tools that served unknown purposes, and a slew of devices that could either be weapons or devices of mundane purpose. One item struck him as odd, so he pulled it from the bottom of the box. The thing, whatever it was, appeared to be a blob of amorphous gel suspended in a thin rubbery shell that shifted and moved even as Pat held it still. The red-gray ooze inside of the squishy pouch shifted in his hands, as though it sought to free itself from the prison. The worst sensation for the Thridril was the feeling that the substance was gripping his arms and increasing in temperature. The disgusting feeling made him drop it involuntarily, letting it hit the floor with a loud plap. Thomas jerked his head away from the screen, his eyes locked on the fallen item. "Hey, careful, dude. You don't know what that stuff is, and I sure as hell don't want it." His voice trailed off as the jiggling mass on the floor triggered memories in his mind. He wasn't sure why, but he couldn't take his eyes off of it. Pat, can you bring me that real quick? Carefully, please. Pat complied and delicately scooped the odd balloon of goop up from the floor before sliding it onto the desk with slow, deliberate movements. The engineer looked at the thing with a concerned look, the sense of recognition he felt making him wary of the seized item. He reached a hand out and turned it over, finding the item tag taped to the underside. He read the label with a cold feeling of understanding and dread seeping into him. Tom, my senses tell me that you are in a fear response state. Would it be wise to vacate the location? His 6 legs were all shaking as his flat voice wavered slightly. He had been told from multiple people that humans were quite a bold and determined race, and that anything that scared them was a high-threat object that posed an even higher level of danger to one as small as him. As soon as Thomas confirmed his worries, he was prepared to flee the room in an instant. Thomas glanced at him and realized just how scared Pat was. He knew that some of the races in the GTS had over-exaggerated fables regarding humans, so he was usually a lot more careful with how expressive he was. Looks like this might have been a bad time to show fear. Maybe, but I think we're good right now. You can calm down, bud. There's no real danger right now. The shaking legs didn't stop, but his voice was calm once more. Oh, that is pleasing to know. He took a tentative step towards the human, then another as he put himself on the opposite side of Tomed from the danger slime. His fuzzy green head peeked around the back of the office chair as he asked, "What is the hazard this item possesses?" Thomas was already a step ahead of his worried friend, his fingers flipping across the folders on his desk as he searched for the matching file. "I'm hoping I'm wrong about this, but this might be compound OSFG." He found the folder and quickly opened it to read the properties listed within. "Describe this item, please, Tom." Pat was clutching the sleeve of the engineer's shirt, his eyes scanning the folder on the desk, despite his lack of understanding of the terms used. Thomas fought hard not to react to what he was reading, though he could still feel his heart hammering in his chest. This item, listed as Ship Sealant TVX-2, was almost an exact recreation of compound OSFG. As he read the file, he narrated his abridged version to his borderline panicked spider friend. So, this stuff is pretty much exactly what I thought it was. A weapon we used to make called oxyburn. It's a terrible sludge that likes to suck up a whole lot of oxygen in a really short amount of time, making itself denser while spreading out further to find more O2. The bigger it got, the worse the stuff got at taking in more air. But also the easier it was to set it off. All it takes is a little energy, electrical or thermal, and the whole mix goes off like a bomb. If it didn't suffocate you, the blast of the fires would be what ended your life. Pat took on a darker hue as his heart rate spiked. A terrible thing? Such destruction and pain. You say you made it in previous meaning? Your people stopped the making of it? That we did. It was supposed to be an alternative fuel source, but the stuff was too volatile. Even when we used it as a weapon, you were at the same level of risk as your target. All it takes is just a little air, and it'll swell up and prime itself for detonation, regardless of if it was inside your ship or the enemy base. Even handling it could end up with your entire facility turning into a crater. The name itself is a good indicator of just how big the blast was when it got fully charged. OSFG means oxygen-saturated fission gel. Fission means nuclear exploding? His already poor grasp of galactic standard was slipping, making his already hasty words more difficult to form. Thomas put a hand on his shoulder and gave him a reassuring smile. Not this stuff, thank God. It's pretty damn close, but there isn't any fissile material in this one. If this stuff did break out, we'd have to get out of here, yeah. But when it caught fire, it wouldn't take the city with it. The way he had phrased it did nothing to ease Pat's concerns. Why here? Selling ships, how? Thomas flipped it to the next page, his face turning pale as he read the operation instructions. Holy shit, these guys were insane. These Kurgeralden guys would coat their ship in this stuff while in space, stick on a plate of hull armor, then blast the stuff with oxygen. Once it was charged up, they'd set it off like thermite and melt the hull plates together. His eyes flicked between the different notes made on the right usage and mixing procedure, though he couldn't believe what he was reading. Lunatics, every one of them. The only reason they haven't blown themselves up is because they've been mixing it with metal filings to even the welds. Be what? 30% success rate? The sudden outburst made Pat curl into a defensive ball. In his mind, the shifting mass of gel on the table might rupture at any moment and kill them both. He began whimpering in his native tongue, which to Thomas would sound like soft whistling noises. The human noticed how his actions had affected him and knelt down by his prone form. "Shit! I'm so sorry, Pat! I didn't mean to spook you, honest." He gently placed a hand on his small back and ran a hand across the short hair on his head. The whimpering stopped, but he refused to uncurl. Thomas let out a sigh as he continued to reassure him. "Really, I'm sorry, buddy. Would some chocolate make you feel better?" Pat slowly peeked up from his knotted limbs, his narrow golden eyes peering up at the looming shape above him. "Accepted apology. Desire Hershey's for recompense." He outstretched a hand, expecting the candy now rather than later. With a scoff, Thomas rummaged through the drawer of sweets for his friend. He handed him another bar before sitting back at the desk, his eyes darting from the file to the item rapidly. Eventually, he let out another sigh, though this one was one of relief rather than worry. "I'm no chemist, but this stuff doesn't look as bad as oxyburn." The little spider person was already a few bites into his treat, and a few feet away from the desk as he inquired, "What will be done to it?" That was a good question. He pondered it for a moment, then realized that the answer was just one floor down. "Well, first off, this stuff is going in the incinerator. I'll explain the situation to the division head, but I know as soon as I mention that we've had this stuff banned in all of UN territory, he's going to approve of my disposal idea." He slowly lifted an empty trash bin from the floor and slid the jiggling blob inside. Once secured, he used the roll of packing tape he had to make a lid from a few layers of adhesive strips. He swiftly typed into the console a message that would let his boss know what was going on. Once that was done, he switched his personal data pad on and scrolled up through his contacts, stopping on the info for one particular Corellown who he knew would understand the urgency of the situation. "Now, I'm going to call up a friend of mine so we can get this case going ASAP. She'll get the ball rolling, I'm sure." His data pad chirped an affirmation as he clicked on one of his contacts. For a moment, he stood there with the device by his head, but eventually there was a small beep and his face spread into a wide smile. "Hey, Mabu, how's it going?" Pat recognized the name and was surprised with how casually the human had addressed a senior member of the Bureau. He had only heard from gossip among colleagues about her, but she was notoriously adherent to the code of conduct it in place. Thomas had told him before that she was the one who had set his new career in motion, though he assumed that he must have simply been a prospective hire. Regardless, he listened to their conversation as he consumed the remainder of his candy. The voice from the other side of the microphone sounded tired, but also alert and somewhat happy. "Hello, Tom. I am well. Is there any particular reason you are contacting me on my personal device, rather than through the official channels?" "Actually, there is, and it's kind of important. Maybe even urgent." Mabu's voice became tense across the line. "I am listening." Thomas rubbed at his neck and looked at the trash bin holding the volatile slime. "I've got something down here on the data storage floor that is near identical to a compound that the UN put a full ban on. Nasty stuff, really dangerous and volatile, the kind of thing that could explode if handled improperly. We got rid of it because of how dangerous it was, both because of how unreliable of a weapon it was, and because it was too dangerous to be a fuel source. Here's the kicker. It's registered as Sealant TVX-2, made for spaceship plating by some race by the name of Kurgeralden. You got any info on them?" For a moment the room was silent, undoubtedly as Mabu hastily typed up the information regarding the race in question. "I do. They operate primarily as an autocratic government that specializes in heavy industry. Patents held by them are all open licenses, including all of their chemicals. Yes, there it is. TVX-2 is one of these solutions. Go ahead and send me the files you have as well as your report." A sly chuckle came from Thomas. "I knew you'd jump at something like this. Do not get the wrong idea, Thomas. I am merely realizing the potential dangers of this product, as well as recognizing your aptitude for this task. Thank you for bringing this to my attention as quickly as you did." Rolling his eyes, Thomas typed up the last of his report at lightning speed. All yours, Mavu. I entrust this case to you. Good work. I'll get this case file ready to be used by the end of my shift. Keep up the good work and take care, my friend. A soft beep came from the phone once more, and Thomas slid the device into his pocket. He leaned back in his chair and let out a dry laugh. He looked over at Pat with a tired smile. Looks like we're done here, and just before the end of lunch. Pat crumpled up the empty wrapper of his chocolate bar and set it on the desk, since the only trash can was currently occupied. I offer thanks for this luxury. I believe it is with wisdom that I return to my nest. Too many fear emotions to conquer. I would do well finding rest soon instead of later. Thomas nodded in agreement and stood up so he could guide the shaken tech worker back to the elevator. He pushed the call button and waited for the elevator. So, Pat, do you still want to trade lunches? The question numbed the mind of Pat Darrow on Slagoof to such an extent that he thought it must have been a joke. Though he took no humor from it, he responded without thinking. Appreciate offer, though perhaps the room designated for rest and nutrient consumption is where we will meet. This place is not possible to be where we meet. Pat stepped onto the elevator alone, his eyes not focusing on the world around him. Thomas reached inside and hit the button for the lobby for him. As the doors shut, he felt bad for the poor little guy. All he wanted was a little companionship during lunch, and instead, he had been shown a literal bomb. Oh well, he thought, there's always next week. He turned back towards the only room on this floor that had any light, ready to keep going.